Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. And on this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, sport, and anything else we can think of. And now today's guest is a former police sergeant, an author, an historian, and I'm sure I've missed something else. So we can catch up in a minute. I first heard of him at the Buxton Battle of Ideas, and I know people went there and said actually his debate he was in was very good. His name is Tom Andrews, and we're going to talk today about the state of policing in the UK. Hello, Tom.
Hello, Chris. Nice to meet you, and thank you for the introduction.
Oh, good, good. So I just introduced you there. I did say I probably missed something out. So you just go in a little bit more depth about the roles you currently have and have had.
Yeah, no problem. So I was a police officer, as you said, for 13 years within Nottinghamshire, mostly in uniform and frontline roles, including neighbourhoods, emergency response, and proactive policing. I left that in 2020, late 2020, to join the academic world, where I now train new police officers to sort of in the way of policing theory and criminology and things. And then around that, I do a lot of work around the history of policing as well.
Okay, okay, cool. So what made you leave? Because obviously you went to sergeant, which means pretty high up. So what made you leave that and decide actually I want to teach and write about the police force?
Yeah, so I really enjoyed policing, and it's all I could ever remember wanting to do since I was a young child. But when I got promoted to a sort of supervisory role, I found I much more enjoyed helping develop the next generation of police officers coming through. And I felt that I could do that better and influence more people and try and make policing a more positive environment by moving into the academic sphere where I could train a whole generation of police officers rather than just the ones that ended up on my shift.
Okay. So how long have you been doing that for now, the writing and the lecturing?
So I've been doing that now for 3 years at, first of all, De Montfort University in Leicester, and now most recently at Derby University, where I train new police officers from Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire.
So when you started doing that, obviously you have students there that want to go into policing, but were the most common misconceptions about policing before they started the course?
Oh, what a question. I think some of the most common misconceptions are perhaps what they get from the police TV sort of fly on the wall documentaries like Police Interceptors and Traffic Cops and things, that all of policing is glamorous and all cases are solved nice and neatly within an hour. Um, and I think the amount of time that they'll spend sort of catching actual criminals and sort of chasing actual criminals and things, and then when they actually start doing the job, that's actually a surprisingly small part of being a police officer, which is a much more holistic profession, I think, in terms of safeguarding communities, safeguarding the vulnerable, helping support people and things, than perhaps new recruits and general members of the public realise.
So he talks about the holistic approach, and one of the common, I don't know if it's a misconception or not, is it seems to be a lot more paper based or admin based now, the police force, than it was a few decades ago. Would that be a fair assumption?
Absolutely so, yes. Yeah, so I can remember even when I joined in 2008 that when you arrested somebody, you could process them in, like book them into custody, deal with the case, and perhaps either charge or release them, etc., within a few hours. However, by the time that I'd left, with changes throughout the whole criminal justice system, mostly driven by the courts and the Crown Prosecution Service, who are sort of the government's lawyers who prosecute cases, um, and the general amount of actual evidence that's generated, especially through digital technology now, takes up huge, huge amounts of time to process that paperwork and investigations. And the workloads around that and producing that paperwork are significant now, far more than they were even sort of 15, 20 years ago.
Is that, and this isn't me trying to let police off the hook at all, but is that one reason why certain crimes aren't being solved, or so because it's just one reason, maybe paperwork or admin?
Yeah, no, I would say so, and it certainly was a factor in why I chose to leave the police. That the demands, particularly by the Crown Prosecution Service, are getting larger and larger in terms of the amount of evidence that they want from the police before they will charge, the nature of that evidence, and the various sort of bureaucratic means that they want that presented. Um, so, for example, they might now, the Crown Prosecution Service are given targets of how many successful cases they have at court. And I think it's somewhere in the region of 85% of the cases that they take to court, they are expected to win. And that obviously then influences their decision-making process when they say the police can or can't charge a suspect that they've been dealing with. And I don't think you'd find a police officer anywhere that will turn around and say they haven't arrested a suspect who they are very sure is guilty of the offence that they've been arrested for, but either the evidence just doesn't exist to be able to take that to the Crown Prosecution Service, or the Crown Prosecution Service have turned around and said, no, we need more evidence before we take this to court, just because they have to be satisfied that they are 85% likely to succeed at court.
Is that because, in regards to the amount of evidence you have to collect and the process by which you collect it, is that because of actual general malfeasance of the police from decades gone past, i.e., like the McPherson report, which highlighted it, what happened with the Met with regards to Stephen Lawrence?
Yeah, no, I don't think, certainly in my experience across various teams and various decades, that malfeasance within the police is a factor in that at all. Um, there perhaps is, in some very small minority of cases, perhaps an element of laziness or just genuine mistake on the part of the police officers, which is probably compounded by the fact that over the last decade or so, under the austerity measures from the Conservative government, that experienced police officers have left policing, and now 1/3 of all police officers in the country have less than 5 years' experience. Um, and I think it's important to recognise that the experience is hugely important within policing in terms of being able to recognise what evidence is available, how to get that, how to interview suspects well, and everything. But unfortunately, the treatment of police officers by politicians and the media, especially, has meant that a lot of sort of more experienced, like mid-career police officers, such as myself, and I know many other colleagues have left due to that kind of pressure, I guess, from politicians and the media around trying to paint police officers as corrupt or malfeasant, etc. Um, Mostly to try and cover up their own failings, particularly in terms of politics or in the media. They look for scapegoats other than themselves, etc. So I think the police workforce is very young, very inexperienced, and that will have an impact on it, as well as just being hugely overworked. So obviously, since 2012, the government cut 20,000 police officers. They have since recruited that same amount back again, but that's only 20,000. It takes it back up to the numbers that existed in 2012, whereas the UK population since that time has increased by sort of several million people. So the ratio of police officers per head of population is still far smaller than it was 10 years ago. And the amount of work that they're now required to do, as we sort of considered before, is exponentially greater as well. So it's all that extra work that they're required to do with fewer numbers of police officers able to do it.
Do things like social media and body cams, I'm not saying, I don't think it's in a bad way, but do they add to the pressure of police doing their work? Do they actually scrutinise police more?
Um, it certainly scrutinises police more, and I don't think you'll find many officers that are anti body worn video, particularly because I know so many instances whereby people have made complaints about police officers, for example, and those police officers can be exonerated almost immediately by the body worn video footage that shows that actually they haven't done anything wrong. And in fact, police officers, or nobody likes bad police officers more than other police officers, because it gives the whole police a bad reputation. And so those who are doing illegal or immoral acts that are caught on body worn video footage are quite rightly dismissed very quickly and very rapidly. And I think the introduction of body worn video has been praised massively by the majority of hard-working, honest police officers, and in terms of being able to clear sort of any allegations made against them that are incorrect, but also root out those cops that they wouldn't, and quite rightly the public wouldn't want to be police officers. So yeah, I think the body worn videos. There's plenty of statistics out there that show that violence against police officers is reduced when police officers have body worn video. Um, Sort of use of force by police officers is reduced when there's body worn video, and the number of complaints against police officers is reduced when there's body worn video. So yeah, I think it's a hugely positive introduction.
So what's the law around it now? Like it has to be on um, all the time, and if that's the case, so sorry, what's the law around it regarding police officers?
So there isn't actually any legislation around it. It's all governed by policy. Most forces will have a policy that it's kind of shifting. When it was brought in, the policy generally was if you're going to be in some kind of confrontational situation, potentially, then you will activate your body worn video. That then developed to include all stop and search encounters. It needs to be activated, and a lot of forces now and a lot of officers individually are moving to a situation where, as soon as they arrive at an incident and get out of the police car, for example, they will activate their camera right from the get go and only deactivate it when they leave the incident or when they arrive in a custody facility with somebody that they've arrested.
What's the actual time on them? Like the battery time on them? Is it quite high? I imagine like a few
I,
hours.
I honestly couldn't tell you. They part of the procurement exercise would have been to get cameras with high battery life. Obviously, because they are expected to record several hours on a daily basis. But different forces use different cameras and things. But yeah, they do have a reasonably decent battery life.
You said in a previous answer that obviously bad cops, police officers hate bad cops because it gives a police force a bad name. But then some like I wasn't going to focus on particular cases, but Sarah ever came to the case because the man who'd done it, the police officer who'd done that, correct me if I'm wrong, like you had certain police officers, and I'm not saying it was a whole met, but there's certain police officers that were texting and talking. He had like a nickname which described what he was like, and also some of the actions he did beforehand. Well, I was like, what's your views on that, and why wasn't that actually questioned before that tragedy happened?
I think a lot of the answers to that were kind of exposed by Baroness Casey's report that she released. I think it was in May or June of this year, um, where she highlighted issues with the culture. And she was only looking at the Met Police, um, but certainly within the diplomatic protection group that Wayne Couzens was a part of, and then David Carrick after him. It was also obviously convicted with numerous sex offences. Um, it's it's difficult because there is a very sort of, I don't know, fraternal, that that implies it's only a male thing, but it is a predominantly fraternal culture within policing, that it will take time to get rid of it, is the only sort of thing. I think certainly cops from perhaps a bit more of an old school mentality conform to that kind of macho culture, um, where they have perhaps tolerated some of those ideas, where they might have individually not called those behaviours out and not agreed with it. They've allowed others who hold those views to air those views in a kind of permissive environment. I think that's changing rapidly. Certainly following the murder of Sarah Everard and the convictions of Wayne Couzens and David Carrick and the Charing Cross WhatsApp groups and everything. I think that culture is changing rapidly, not rapidly enough. I don't think you'll find anybody that says the culture is changing rapidly enough. But there is a massive desire to change that culture. And as the new generation comes into policing, um, with that mindset, the sort of the Me Too generation and the number of women in policing, both in terms of civilian roles and in police officer roles, is increasing all the time as well as a percentage. And I think that is bringing with it significant changes as well. So I'm very optimistic about the future. But as you alluded to with the Macpherson report from the late 90s, that identified this culture of racism and things within policing, it has taken a long time to get rid of that, to the point it's still not even being gotten rid of, as Baroness Casey found in her review as well. Um, so it takes time and a generational shift, I think, to change these cultures. Um, but it certainly is moving in the right direction.
There's been a lot, especially this year when it comes, well, not even just this year, last 2, 3 years, when you talk about protest and how people are saying that we have this two-tier policing system, and they use protest as the example to back that up, where there seems to be certain protesters that are arrested a lot far more quickly than others, even though others are certain to do more vandalism, so to speak. Is that the reality or the perception, or is it somewhere in between?
I'd I'd say fundamentally and probably almost entirely that is perception. Um, there's it's really interesting if you read both right wing and left wing media or watch right wing and left wing media. Both sides of this so-called culture wars are accusing the police of this two-tier policing system and favoriting one side of the argument over another. And I think it's really interesting because the policing of protest within the UK is governed by lots and lots of legislation that fundamentally is aimed at enabling protests and demonstrations to go ahead. The current government are or have introduced legislation that seeks to kind of undermine that, but the key legislation around protests and demonstrations and things has been in place since the Public Order Act of 1986. And police chiefs are under an obligation to facilitate and enable any and all demonstrations and protests unless there is a hugely intelligence-based, credible threat that there is going to be a serious risk of disorder resulting from that demonstration. Um, and I think it's important to look at. I know this discussion came particularly from the Metropolitan Police's decision to allow the protests, the sort of pro-Palestinian protests and demonstrations, to go ahead on Armistice Day on the 11th of November. And it's important to look at that as that was the fifth protest in a series of protests every week on a Saturday since the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in the previous weeks, in the run up to that, there'd been an average of say 40 arrests from the protests. So that's the statistics that I've looked up before we've had this conversation. And to place that in perspective in terms of serious and violent disorder and things, the Notting Hill Carnival, for example, that takes place every year, has an average of around 100 arrests, including many for weapons and serious violence. In 2022, there was somebody murdered on the periphery of the carnival. Glastonbury Music Festival has a similar number of arrests every year in the 100 mark. But yet there's no discussion as to whether we should allow those events to take place or not. And I think with the sort of pro-Palestinian demonstration versus the right wing sort of, I don't know, the English Defence League led sort of counter protests on that same day. It's important to remember that both parties were enabled to protest and demonstrate. The pro-Palestinian march was allowed to go ahead. It was several hours after the Armistice Day celebrations. It was at least 2 miles away from the cenotaph location. And there were several arrests made at the time. But when it comes to public order policing, it's not always suitable and appropriate to arrest people at the time as well. So you can see, obviously, protests are large crowds of people, if the police go in and start dragging people out of that crowd, the police are going to be outnumbered. The crowd's going to turn even more and more hostile towards the police. So any arrests have to be made with serious consideration around the impact of it and the amount of resources it's going to take to facilitate that. And in today's sort of digital enabled world where there's CCTV cameras everywhere, police officers have body worn video cameras, as we've said. There are specialist evidence gathering teams with high resolution video cameras and things that can capture offences on that footage. There is nothing that stops the police dealing with suspected offenders after the incident. But obviously that just doesn't make the headlines and things. But some really good examples of that are, it's happened in America, but the US Capitol riots, for example, at the start of the year following the election of Joe Biden, there were very few arrests made on the day. However, investigations led police and law enforcement agencies to arrest hundreds of people in the months that followed. And it's exactly the same with public order policing in the UK.
So obviously the police aren't going to tell others about individual cases, but are those stats actually available on a website or for freedom of information request? So say, for example, there's a demonstration, pro-Palestine demonstration on a particular date. Could you actually request a freedom of information request from the Met and say how many people are arrested from each side? Would they actually allow that?
Yeah, certainly they would, yeah, because that wouldn't constitute private data. They wouldn't give you the names of the people arrested, but they also routinely publish it anyway. Um, Certainly, the statistics around Notting Hill Carnival I got from the Met Police website that they put up there. Similarly, the Glastonbury Festival, I obtained that from the Avon and Somerset Police website, and the stats around the number of arrests from the marches beforehand. I found in newspapers, so journalists have got those stats and things as well. So yeah, definitely freely available if you were to request them.
You said that one of the factors when policing protest is to do with the whole issue of threat. What's how is a threat legally defined?
That's a brilliant question. So within a policing context, the key three ideas are threat, risk, and harm. And the threat aspect of that is the nature of what the offence is going to be. Like, how serious is that? You can obviously have a threat of, well, I'm going to say something nasty to you, or you could have a threat of, I'm going to kill you. Um, that then gets paired with the risk of how likely is that to happen. Um, Obviously, that risk can be immediate, or it can be delayed, or it can be sort of negated by various factors such as time, distance, of ability of the person to carry out that threat, etc. And then the harm is going to be the severity of what would happen if that threat was realised. And so these are the core decision-making principles within policing that factor into any um, sort of any kind of incident within policing at all. At the point that an incident is reported to the police, that threat, risk, and harm is assessed by an initial call handler on a 999 call, for example, right through to the sort of pro-Palestine demonstrations, etc., like football matches, etc., where that threat, risk, and harm can be analysed by experts, public order policing experts, intelligence experts, etc., to reach a conclusion about the nature of the policing response to it, like whether it needs one, what kind of response that will be. Is it going to be like a PCSO or two to show a presence, or is it going to be like hundreds of officers in full riot gear, etc.? And that's what kind of dictates the response to it. And that's obviously all based on previous intelligence involving the groups that are involved. So have they been violent before? What are their views? Can we identify anybody that's specifically associated with that movement, who perhaps is like a figurehead and is perhaps likely to incite violence, etc., with that movement? And all of those factors go into determining what the police response to a certain situation is going to be, and what tactics that they'll employ.
The reason I bring that up is because of Just Stop Oil, because there has been an occasion where they've stood in like a road or sat in the road and not let ambulances through. So therefore, is legally would that constitute a threat to some potentially threat to someone else's life?
It certainly would if they're blocking an ambulance, and I know I think that's only one example, and I think the Just Stop Oil protesters apologised for that afterwards. That sort of on reflection, they should have let the ambulance through. And I think that's where potentially a gap in legislation has emerged that the government have moved to legislate to close, in that previously demonstrations, people were allowed to demonstrate for any cause as long as there wasn't going to be that threat, risk, and harm aspect. There wasn't any consideration as to the impact on the general public trying to go about their daily business. And that's what the government have introduced as part of I think it's police courts and sentencing bill, that brought protests and things, especially in Bristol last year around. But certainly one of the considerations now is the impact that a demonstration or protest will have on the wider public, and gives police extra powers to use sort of additional force or additional resources, etc., if a protest is causing an adverse and excessive disruption to the daily lives of sort of other people.
We've talked about the cuts and how they're having an impact as well. I remember many years ago, I was at work and I got a text, still at work the next morning, from a housemate saying where I was living had been burgled. And they never did catch the person because it was almost like a blitz burglary. They burgled so many houses on the same street. Um, and obviously, in something like that, she, because I never met the police, she called them and they dealt with it straight away. And she said actually they were very good, and at times, but even now we're admitting to her that it might be a struggle because of finding very little evidence. But I just wonder, when you hear these stories about, oh, so and so has been arrested for a rogue tweet, or that story earlier in the year, was it where the woman called the police officer, oh, was it lesbian nana and that sort of thing? I don't know if you heard about that one.
I didn't hear about that one. No, not heard that
Oh,
one.
right, okay, yeah. But again, where people are getting arrested for tweets or other silliness like that, can you understand why the public get annoyed, especially when other crimes aren't being solved or taken as seriously?
I think a part of that stems from what society's expectations of the police are. The police have to investigate everything that is reported to them. Fundamentally, the policing model in Britain is policing by consent. And a part of that is being focused on a victim's needs. And if a victim is reporting a crime, police officers are expected to obviously take a report of that crime and investigate every allegation of crime that is reported to them. And I think, unfortunately, with the advent of social media, that availability and accessibility of people to, as you say, share views or opinions that might well tip over that line from free speech to malicious communications or harassment, etc. Unfortunately, it's all too easy for that to do. I think there's been a move away from sort of personal accountability in society as well, with that sort of digitalization, that anonymity that the internet brings and things. People become keyboard warriors essentially, and sit behind the keyboard and don't think there's any real world repercussions for what they say. There were, as part of the cuts as well, that you kind of introduced the question with, community policing was one of the first areas and one of the biggest areas that was impacted by the financial cuts as a result of austerity. In my own example, I joined a neighbourhood policing team in 2013, and there were 8 police officers and 14 PCSOs on that neighbourhood policing team. By the end of 2016, after the cuts had come in, there was 4 police officers and 6 PCSOs. So a huge loss in staffing numbers on that one station alone in community policing. And fundamentally, it's community policing that solves these crimes like burglaries, um, where the community police officers will have a knowledge and be able to link series of burglaries together. They will have a knowledge of who the burglars are on their areas and whether they're in prison or not at the time, or whether they're rehabilitated and no longer offending, or the different methods that those burglars use to commit the crimes. So the loss or the massive reduction of that community policing has had a huge impact. I can absolutely sympathise with the public who feel that they're not getting an adequate policing response to um, some of the crimes that they're reporting. And I can assure you and the listeners that police officers feel that too. Um, it's very disheartening coming into a shift at the start of a shift and there being several outstanding jobs that need attending that could be hours, if not days old. But there just hasn't been the staff available in order to meet that demand. And I don't know a cop that hasn't joined the police who doesn't have that passion to want to go out there and catch bad guys and help people who are victims of crime. So yeah, it's really hard for the officers as well. Um, and yeah, all the officers I know work hugely long hours and very hard to be able to try and meet their victims' needs. But unfortunately, there just aren't enough of them.
Many years ago, funny enough, I think it was on Joe Rogan's podcast. He had a police psychologist on, and she was talking about the shootings in America. And I know police, apart from certain special branches or certain parts of police, would have guns here. But one of the things she says about the decision making is that the officers are almost working too many hours, and as a result, like that, especially if you've got a police officer going, that's making not snap decisions. Is that a problem in the UK as well? That the amount of officers, so amount of hours police officers are working is actually, has it increased, decreased, stayed the same? And how is that impacting their work practice?
So yeah, no, that's a brilliant question. There's so many factors that play into that decision making around police officers and their ability to make those decisions. A key aspect of that is the 24/7 nature of the job and working the night shifts. And certainly, you talk about armed officers there; they obviously have to be available 24/7. The same with emergency response officers, have to cover um, that 24/7, 365 days of a year shift pattern. Um, and there's so much research out there that shows working nights is hugely impactful on your decision making, your sort of natural bodily functions, your ability to even digest food, let alone process things at a higher level. Um, Coupled with the long hours, sort of a standard police shift is either 10 or 12 hours long in most forces. So it's a long time to be at work. And the rotating nature of those shifts and things as well obviously brings a lot of difficulty to it. It's a very high pressure situation. You're, as a police officer, you're expected to make judgments in a matter of seconds or less that can have huge life altering consequences that can then be scrutinized in hindsight for even decades afterwards. Um, Police officers are given lots of training around that decision making. Obviously, they get lots of experience, muscle memory, and things like that. That previous experiences that they've had, previous jobs that they've attended, they can relate those experiences to the new experiences they're going to. Um, there's all Police officers are human, and I think that's the really important thing to remember that all humans are adversely impacted by stress, working night shifts, high pressure situations, etc. I think police officers are very good in terms of the amount of decision making training that they are given, especially going into specialist roles where they might be carrying tasers or firearms. Um, the decision making and the sort of debriefing of those decisions afterwards is really important within policing and taken very seriously, because I think organizational and individual learning is a huge part of policing these days. In terms of the police will be the first to admit that they do make mistakes and have made mistakes in the past, and that they need to constantly change and adapt to keep up with new technologies and new means of crime and criminality. Um, and so every incident is a learning opportunity to develop policing for the better.
Okay. Speaking of split decisions, excuse me, one of the areas I'm interested in is police and how to deal with people or suspects who are suffering from mental health issues as well, and kind of linked to officers who have died in police custody. Now, we'll start with the latter because I've spoken to people who know the police and say actually that perception of police is unfair because what are police supposed to do? Like, how much training did they get for mental health, like mental health training did they get in terms of dealing with someone who may have schizophrenia or depression or some other mental illness? And also in terms of custody, um, arresting someone, putting them in a van, and then taking them to like a cell. What is the process? What is that process? Because the stories I've heard, it seems to be very mysterious. I don't know if that's media reporting, but just start with the mental health first. Like, what are your views on that, and what could be improved with regards to police officers and how to deal with mental health?
So policing and how they deal with mental health is a huge area within policing sort of strategy and organisation at the moment. So just a couple of headline statistics would be that in 2015, the College of Policing, who are the sort of professional body for police officers, estimated that between 20 and 40% of police time was spent dealing with people with mental health crises. And as much as 83% of police time, according to an estimate by a chief constable in 2017, um, is not spent dealing with crime. It's spent dealing with mental health incidents, vulnerability, and missing people, etc. So it's a huge, huge aspect of policing. But when you think about what policing is, police officers are supposed to be law enforcers and not people there who are dealing with a mental health crisis. The clue's in the name, it's a health problem.
Mhm.
Um, and several forces, pioneered by Humberside Police and recently taken up by the Metropolitan Police, is a concept called right care, right person. Um, and the aim of that is to say that, well, hang on, we are the police. If people are having a mental health crisis, why is it that somehow we have de facto become the organisation that has to deal with that? Where it's a health crisis, it should be the NHS. And there's been a lot of pushback from these police forces saying, actually, if it is solely a mental health crisis, then we are not going to attend. It's for the ambulance service or for community mental health practitioners to deal with it. Now, that obviously can't be the case all the time. There are going to have to be instances where people suffering from mental health crises have committed a criminal offence or are suspected of committing a criminal offence, and the police have to be involved in that. And police officers do get some training in recognising symptoms of mental health. It's something that they get in their initial training before they hit the streets. It's then they can then get top ups on that periodically throughout their careers as legislation develops or as perhaps an incident happens where somebody with a mental health issue has either died or been sort of adversely impacted by as a result of police contact or following police contact. So there are going to be times where the police have to get involved, but they get training in recognising the symptoms and how to deal with that. But I think the issue is that a lot of policing is about how you talk to people and being able to rationalise and negotiate with people and explain situations to them. And because of the complexities in mental health conditions, people suffering mental health crises, be that through sort of long-term mental health issues, neurodiversity, or acute conditions brought on by excessive drug or alcohol misuse. It's impossible to reason with those people. They can't think rationally for themselves, let alone process rational arguments or requests from people that are there fundamentally trying to help them. So it does mean that, unfortunately, the ability to reason and rationalise with people is often goes out the window far quicker than it would do with somebody who's not suffering from those conditions, and therefore it ends up in a sort of higher use of force more quickly than it would do dealing with somebody who's not suffering from sort of a mental health crisis or neurodiversity, etc. police officers will adapt tactics accordingly. They're I'm not going to say every police officer because that's always not going to be the case. There's always going to be a small minority who are sort of attracted to that violent nature or whatever. But the huge vast majority of police officers are there to help people. Um, they don't want to hurt somebody or cause harm to anybody that is having a health breakdown. They are there to ensure the safety and well-being of that person. So they will use the minimum amount of force necessary to make sure that that person is controlled in a safe manner, and then enabled to get the help that they need. And legislation, thanks to campaigning by police organisations like the Police Federation and National Police Chiefs Council and things, has changed in the last decade, that it now puts a lot more onus on the NHS. If police detain somebody having a mental health crisis, the NHS have to now find a bed for that person. Whereas even as recently as sort of 6, 7 years ago, the NHS could turn around and say, no, we haven't got bed space for that person. You have to take them to a police station. So things are getting better. But I think there is a huge gap in mental health emergency response provision that currently the police are filling, but it should be a duty of the NHS or another agency to kind of fill that gap and take that responsibility.
So it would be preferable if the police were more like a support barrier. So say if you had someone who was suffering from some form of mental illness and they had a weapon of some kind, obviously you'd have the mental health professionals going there first, but you would still have the police coming afterwards in case it develops into something bad. But they'd still be guided by the mental health professionals. Would that be more preferable?
Yeah, so I've done research, actually published a paper on this myself, kind of examining this issue. And my recommendation out of that was to create almost like a fourth emergency service who have like similar equipment to the police in terms of like body armor, handcuffs, and perhaps even tasers or sort of parva spray, etc., pepper spray. But they are mental health professionals, so they would respond to these mental health crises, have all the powers to use force and detain people, but don't have that associated aspect of being law enforcers. They are just there to deal with the mental health issue. So they would go to the people threatening to jump off bridges or buildings. They would go to the people threatening to kill themselves with knives at their throat and things, and have all the same powers and use of force as the police do at the moment, but remove that stigma that comes with policing of that they are law enforcement agents as well. Because a really good quote that I've heard from a sort of a leading criminology professor is that where the police are around, people will get arrested. There's no escaping that. So if you remove the police from that mental health crisis, it removes any option to take that person to a cell or to a police station, and it has to be dealt with as a health matter. And I think personally, I think that's the way forward. Just remove the police from it entirely.
And the second part of my original question was about deaths in custody. I haven't heard too many over the last couple of years, but there was a case when it seemed to be serious, seemed to be regular anyway, and it seemed to be no one seemed to be charged. Again, is this a misconception? And also, what is the process from arresting a suspect to getting them to a cell? And obviously, what checks and balances do you have to make with regards to that?
Yeah. So custody within policing is one of the most regulated areas in terms of scrutiny, policies, and procedures and things. Um, and I think it's fairly unavoidable that there will be people that will die in police custody because of the nature of the people that police officers are dealing with. Dealing with people that are high on drink or drugs, dealing with people in mental health crises who might well be accused of a crime, um, and just people whose lifestyles are such that they are at a higher risk of death than perhaps the general population. So I think deaths in custody are unavoidable completely, and it's the same if you look at the prison population, etc. In terms of the process from getting into custody to getting somebody into a cell, etc., and then releasing them, it's all very dependent on the nature, the sort of signs and symptoms and the nature of the person that's been arrested. A compliant person, for example, will be booked into custody, where a custody sergeant will do a complete risk assessment, asking them if they've got drink issues, drug issues, thoughts of self-harm, mental health concerns, etc. Do a full risk assessment of that person. They will then be sat in a cell, and obviously periodically checked on, taken out for an interview at some point by the investigating officers, and then either charged or bailed at the end of it. People who are suffering from higher risk factors, kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier about risk factors and things. So people who come in who are drunk, or who are under the influence of drugs, or who are suffering acute mental health disorders, etc. That risk assessment that the sergeant does will then be elevated. So it can be as high as somebody is in custody and two police officers are required to sit outside their cell because they are at such a high risk of suicidal tendencies, or of their behaviour, in terms of they are that high on drugs, for example, that they're running around and likely to knock themselves out or cause serious harm in the cell. So it can be as high as two police officers physically sitting outside that cell door to watch the person, through custody officers checking on them every 15 minutes, custody officers checking them every half an hour or hour. Overnight, if that person goes to sleep, it's not uncommon that the custody officers have to wake them up and check that they're still okay and breathing and everything. There's CCTV and audio throughout custody suites everywhere. So everything that is said between detained people, police officers, custody sergeants, detention officers, etc., it's all recorded from a multitude of angles. So it's inevitable that there are going to be deaths in custody, and it goes back to the accountability aspect that we were talking about with the body-worn video cameras. That those minority of officers within the custody setting who would do something outside of those parameters, or as you say, kind of outside of normal practice, etc., are quickly identified and dealt with appropriately in terms of dismissals and things. And the example you gave, I think you said nobody was charged. I am aware of a case, certainly this year, where a custody sergeant was charged and convicted of assaulting a prisoner and sent to prison as a result of it. So there is that accountability.
Where was that? Guess I suppose.
I honestly can't remember off the top of my head, I'm afraid. But I'm sure a quick search on the internet would find that.
You said before that a lot of experienced officers have left, and you've had more young people come in. And it made me think about recruitment. How has the way we recruit police officers changed over the years? I think I kind of mentioned this a little bit before, but yeah.
Yeah. Personally, for me, I don't think recruitment has changed enough. So probably the biggest change came in 2018, when policing moved to becoming a profession that required applicants to either have a degree already or work towards one within the first 3 years of their police training under an apprenticeship scheme. That was rolled back by the former Home Secretary in 2022. So it's no longer a requirement, although the degree entry routes still exist. The aim of that was to professionalise the police force more and give police officers, like new police officers, a better understanding of not just the legislation that they would be using, but about why that legislation exists and how to better make decisions. For example, should we arrest this mentally ill person, or actually is there a better way to deal with it through awareness of mental health support and initiatives, etc., within the community? So that was the aim of the degree entry programs, to better professionalise new police officers and give them that better decision making and empower them with that knowledge. The issue being, primarily, I think, with recruitment, is that every police officer has to start at the rank of a PC. So everybody has to go in at entry level. There were, up until recently, some schemes that people could enter at inspector and superintendent level. So that's sort of the third rank and the fifth rank in the police out of 8. Um, but they died a death a couple of years ago, and a lot of the people that went on them left soon after as well because of the sort of perception of them within the police, that they hadn't done their time as a frontline cop, as it were, and so they kind of left afterwards. But I think it's a big issue with policing that the entry level wages are very poor, so it doesn't necessarily attract people from other professions. It only kind of attracts younger people into the job. For example, like the starting wage of a police officer is £28,500, which sounds pretty good. But minimum wage, if you worked 40 hours a week on minimum wage, that only equates to 22,500. So entry level cops are getting 6,000 a year more than the minimum wage. Which, when you factor in that they're working night shifts, weekends, bank holidays such as Christmas, etc., it's not a huge incentive. Plus the risk of being assaulted, and the amount of responsibility that you have and the scrutiny that you're under. So it doesn't attract mid-career transferees into policing, because anybody with life experience, certainly if they get to like a leadership level of like in private industry, etc., isn't going to want to lose that that high level of wages to go back to an entry level job with higher risk levels and lower wages. And I think policing fundamentally needs to change that to attract more experienced candidates, both in terms of life experience and sort of professional experience. And I think until it does, it is going to unfortunately continue to be and only attract these sort of younger new entrants.
What does a practical, well, how much of the recruitment process is practical, and also what does it entail?
Yeah, so the recruitment process is varies by force depending on what that specific force is looking for. But certainly nationally, there are requirements for a paper application where you are required to demonstrate various competencies, such as times where you've sort of stood up and challenged inappropriate behaviour, times where you've demonstrated team working, personal responsibility, all that kind of stuff. So that's the initial paper application. You will have background checks done as well, obviously making sure that you haven't got criminal convictions or that you're not sort of linked, that you haven't got known associations with serious criminals, etc. You will have to go to what's called an assessment centre, which is kind of a day of role plays, where they will put you through various role play scenarios and see how you deal with those. And whether you've kind of got that mental resilience to be able to deal with those, as well as the customer service ability and that ability to talk to people. And there are sort of basic maths and English tests as well to make sure that obviously you can write a coherent statement and present a report well, and do sort of basic math skills. And then most forces will have an interview as well, whether that's face to face or over sort of Zoom or Teams, just to kind of suss out whether you are able to talk to people, and answer interview questions kind of live on the spot, as it were. There's a fitness test involved where you have to demonstrate that you can reach, I think it's level 5.4 on the bleep test, which is a fairly basic level of fitness, and sort of push and pull tests and things as well, and then kind of health checks as well, to make sure that you haven't got health issues that might affect you on duty. Overall, the process, I think, takes between like 6 months to a year, depending on sort of how quick the various stages work and how many people are looking to be recruited at a time.
Okay. Another thing that's just coming to my head that I wasn't going to speak about, but I hear it a lot in other police interviews, is stop and search. What's the perception of it now? Like, has there been opinion polls on it? And again, how has that changed? Because obviously, a lot of people saying actually just targeting one group.
Mm.
So based on that, how has that the whole process of stop and search changed? Is it a case of you have to really just go ahead and justify not just body cams, but actually justify targeting a particular person in the first place?
Yeah, so I think it's important to stress the difference between targeting an individual, or even the word targeting to begin with is quite a loaded term. And what I'd say is it's more you have to have very substantial grounds to be able to conduct a stop and search now. Certainly, again, when I started in 2008, it was it was scrutinised, and obviously the legislation was still in place. You had to have reasonable suspicion that you'd be able to find something, etc. It was much less scrutinised than it is now, and that changed probably again around 2016 under Theresa May, or probably a little bit earlier, I think, under Theresa May as the Home Secretary, um, where she really clamped down on stop and search. And it's really important. Obviously, it has a huge impact on certain communities, and it's a well publicised statistic that, especially Black people, but anybody generally from Black, Asian, or other minority ethnicity communities, are significantly more likely to be searched than white people. However, my sort of take on that, or my research around that, is more that it's a societal problem in terms of people from Black, Asian, and other minority ethnic communities have been and still are disadvantaged within society as a whole. And unfortunately, that means that people from those communities are statistically more likely to become involved in the types of crime that stop and search targets. Um, for example, sort of weapons-enabled crime and drugs-enabled crime. And the vast majority of stop and searches nationally are for drugs, and of those, the vast majority for cannabis, simply because it's easy to smell it, and that gives you most of the grounds alone. The the issue with the disproportionality as well is that it focuses just on one aspect, which is the colour of somebody's skin primarily. Whereas disproportionality exists in every element of stop and search. So if you are a white woman over the age of 35, the odds of you being stopped and searched are infinitesimally small, but yet you make up at least 25% of the population. Um, so the disproportionality of young people in general, and young males in particular of any ethnicity, are hugely more disproportionately likely to be searched, because there is so much evidence, like it's called the age offending curve, where people between the ages of about 12 through to about 24 is like a bell curve of offending. So people start offending around the age of 12, and then it goes hugely up and kind of peaks around the ages of 16, 17, 18, and then slowly drops off again to 24. And so the police use that knowledge to focus their stop and search efforts on that age group. They focus stop and search efforts in areas where there is high crime. There's no point going out and conducting a stop and search operation in a small leafy village where there is no crime reported or discovered. Whereas inner city areas where there's a lot of deprivation and a lot of sort of drugs and weapons offences, and that intelligence and police recorded crime, etc., around violence and weapons and drugs, etc., that is where stop and search operations will have the most impact. But unfortunately, for historical and cultural reasons that are going to take several more generations at least to overcome, those areas are predominantly inhabited, or disproportionately inhabited, by people from Black, Asian, and other minority ethnic communities, because of how they've been treated and the opportunities that they've had historically in the past. And unfortunately, policing has to function in the society that exists today. It can't operate in a utopian society where everybody is represented equally in all areas, because that's not what society is. And it's I completely understand the impact that this kind of the impact that stop and search can have within those communities. And I used to work on a team that's primary tactic was the use of stop and search, trying to take weapons off the streets within Nottingham. and we were focused in those areas where intelligence said that there were gangs operating, that there were drugs being sold, etc., and people were likely to carry weapons. And unfortunately, those areas are the same areas that we've just spoken about, that are the deprived areas. And but we never got complained about our stop and search, because everybody that we stopped, we would fully explain why we were searching them. We would fully explain the intelligence behind why we were searching them. We'd stop and speak to people first, get their details, find out where they were going, etc. And if there wasn't that intelligence linking them to weapons or drugs, etc., then they'd be on their way. And we were only stopping them for sort of 30 seconds a minute, and then they'd be on their way. But the communities where we were focusing our efforts were actually really grateful that we were there, because we would make the effort of going to community meetings and explaining why we were there, that we were trying to stop young people, particularly young people from the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, from being stabbed and being killed. Um, and and we were there to try to prevent that, and stop and search was a key tactic in that, and was a very successful tactic. But I do understand, particularly the perceptions around stop and search, following on from sort of going all the way back to obviously the Brixton riots of 1981, and the riots that spread nationally sort of around that in Liverpool and Birmingham and things, have carried that remembrance of police mistreatment of people from minority communities. And the people that experienced that are still alive today. The people that experienced it, it didn't change up to the Macpherson report in the 1990s, so it's not changed over 20 years. It's slowly getting better, but the people that have experienced that are still alive, still have had those bad experiences with the police, and it's difficult to change that view, because that's what they've experienced for so long. And they're then telling their children, don't trust the police, etc., because they're only out to get you, etc. But the police are working hard to try and overcome that by getting involved in communities and explaining why they're stop and searching and things. But it's just going to take that generational shift again, to bring that in, better community policing and better engagement with the police and the various communities who are and feel adversely impacted by stop and search.
Yeah, it is an interesting one for sure. And in regards to trust from the police, obviously before this, I mentioned I was going to speak to you about this Hillsborough law.
Yep.
There's one particular aspect of it I was going to speak to you about. For those who are watching from abroad, who don't know what Hillsborough law is. Hillsborough was a football tragedy in 1989, where a number of fans died after a crush offences against the terraces. The media and the police force, which was South Yorkshire, I believe,
Yep.
they blamed their fans for it, and the families of the victims fought for justice to clear their name. And then I can't remember, it was 27 years later, so it was what, 2016?
Yep.
Um, basically, the whole case was taken to court, and the judge basically said, actually, it's not the fans' fault. The police are 100% culpable for what happened. And now we've got this Hillsborough law, which is looking at things such as parity between defence and prosecutions when it comes to lawyers and whatnot. So if you've got like a high-powered lawyer on the defence side, because you're mega rich, and then you got prosecutors with like two people, there's a massive discrepancy there. So it's trying to limit that. But one of the things he talks about in regards to police was this almost like duty of candor. Now, when I first read that, I'll be honest, I thought, that's a bit odd. Not because I don't agree with it, but I'm thinking surely police should have had that anyway. So do you want to explain why that would have had something like that anyway, even especially legally?
It's very interesting, because the police obviously, well, nobody is allowed to lie on a witness statement, etc. It's an offence of perjury to lie on a witness statement. So it's a really interesting aspect. I think it's important to remember that Hillsborough, like you say, took place in the 1980s, at a similar time as the miners' strike in the UK as well, which brought up a lot of similar allegations about police sort of burying or changing evidence, etc. Um, the attitude to policing in the 1980s is a completely different world to the attitude of policing today. Um, we've spoken about body-worn video already, the prevalence of CCTV, other digital media, etc. Everybody now is a citizen journalist with a mobile phone filming everything. Um, I think on a individual level, at sort of frontline police officers, and this came out in the Hillsborough inquest, that individual police officers had written their statements as they had perceived it. It was the kind of hierarchy that then went over it with Tipex, and changed what was written, or instructed the frontline police officers to change what had been written, because the priority was to preserve the integrity of the police. It had, certainly in the 1980s and through to 90s, and I think it was really the Macpherson report that changed that, that the police had to maintain this image of being in this infallible organization nobody could challenge. They just went out and arrested bad guys. They couldn't do anything wrong, etc. And they had to kind of maintain that image and that organizational reputation, etc. That shifted, like the Macpherson report kind of opened the floodgates, and then several other reports since, and the availability of media, then social media, etc., changed that massively. And policing is now a much more open and honest organisation in terms of taking accountability for its failures. I think the problem arises where there is a duty of, or certainly in British society and even more in America, there is this kind of culture of litigation. If somebody makes a mistake or an error, the organisation will get sued, and that plays into this kind of idea of organisations not wanting to apologise, because there's this perception of, if you say sorry, you're admitting wrongdoing. And I think we as a society, again, need to move away from this kind of blame culture of, oh, something's happened, we need to punish that organisation or whatever, rather than look at it as a learning point. And I think if there was that focus on, actually, let's learn from this and change working processes so that something like this can't happen again, that's a much better approach than certainly financially penalising the organisation, which is actually going to take resources away from it. There's obviously a need to ensure that any changes that are brought in are scrutinised and monitored on an ongoing basis to make sure they are actually being brought in and actually stay in place. But the police, certainly since the Macpherson report, and it was demonstrated well in the London bombings of 2005, that openness and transparency and cooperation with public inquiries, and kind of willingness to accept errors, like the mistaken shooting of John Charles de Menezes on the London Underground, and that sort of standing up and saying, look, we got this wrong. It was a fast-moving, dynamic situation. Nothing like this has ever happened before, but we are going to use it as a learning point, and we are changing our tactics, changing our organisational structures to try and prevent something like this happening again. But because of the nature of policing, there's always going to be these new situations coming up where police officers on the ground and police bosses, who are sort of making the like strategic or tactical decisions, don't have anything to draw on, don't have any experience to draw on, don't have time to sit down and work through various options and stuff, and just have to make a call. And unfortunately, sometimes that's going to be the wrong call. Unfortunately, sometimes it's going to be the right call, but there isn't a good outcome. Sometimes it's like whatever action you take is not going to be a good outcome. And that's just the world that policing operates in. And therefore, there's always going to be these mistakes. But policing now is much more open to acknowledging those mistakes and seeking to learn from them than it was in the 1980s, where it was far more keen to kind of preserve that organisational reputation.
I agree with you about the blame culture, but in cases where it's so egregious, like in Hillsborough, can't you do that both? Because you learn from the Hillsborough, but then a lot of officers, as far as I'm aware, haven't gone to prison or even been arrested. So is there some small number of cases where actually, hang on, we need to do both here because the cases are so egregious that something needs to be done?
Yeah, and I think Hillsborough's a difficult example because the decisions that were made on the day at Hillsborough, the coroner's juries and the criminal juries have both reached verdicts that the decisions made by the senior police commanders on the day were made with the best interests of trying to release the crushing and stop the crowds outside the stadium and things. Now, the evidence tampering afterwards is a whole different ball game, and certainly in today's policing landscape and things, anybody found to have altered or tampered with any evidence would immediately be dismissed and sent to prison. Um, I don't know the specifics of Hillsborough of why that wasn't the case with that. I think it was to do with the fact they couldn't prove who it was that had actually tampered with the evidence, and therefore they couldn't criminally prosecute anybody. Which goes back to what we were saying right at the start about that burden of proof and that need that you need to be able to prove in a court of law that this specific person, beyond reasonable doubt, has committed that offence. And obviously, if you can't prove who it is who's actually tampered with the evidence, then you can't take a person to court. But I do think South Yorkshire Police as an organisation was criminally prosecuted over it and found responsible, although I can't swear to that.
Okay, cool. Finally, because it's been a brilliant interview,
Yeah.
but and I know this is a bit of a loaded question, but name a couple of things which you would really like to see change in the police force to make it better in the next, say, 5 years?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I don't think there's any suggestion that policing's perfect. There's always things that are going to be able to change in any organisation and make it better. For me, I think some of the key aspects to make policing better would be to completely overhaul the promotion process, and how leaders at all ranks are identified. Because as we've covered, everybody has to start as a PC and go in at entry level. But the person that makes a really good PC and catches loads of bad guys or investigates cases really well isn't necessarily going to be the same person that can manage a team very well. They might not be the same person that can balance budgets or make sort of strategic command decisions versus like instant operational decisions. So I think the promotion process as to who is chosen to be promoted and how they are promoted needs a big overhaul, as well as looking at perhaps introducing either civilians at sort of higher ranks to be able to do like the budgetary work and organisational or sort of people management, etc., or direct entry to those senior ranks of people who are, say, like, I don't know, supermarket area managers, etc., who've got that knowledge of balancing budgets and managing large teams and stuff. Um, so because it also stifles innovation in terms of these long-serving cops. The current promotion process encourages them to kind of reinvent the wheel all the time and come up with new ideas, because then they can demonstrate those new ideas in their promotion interviews. Whereas there's much less credit if you just stand up and say, well, yeah, I carried on doing what my predecessor did because it was working well.
Mhm.
It doesn't get you anywhere. So it's there's this constant reinvention of the wheel, and I think that needs to change to really focus on what's going to make policing better. If something works well, leave it, identify what doesn't work well, fix that, and then by the time you've done that, the thing that probably was working well before is now starting to not work well, and look at that. So I think for me, that's the most important thing about identifying leadership and where that talent comes from. And I think it's particularly important to look at that with a diversity perspective as well, introducing people from as many other diverse perspectives as possible, whether that be ethnicity, religion, gender, sexual orientation, you name it, as many diverse perspectives as you can have within policing, to because with that diverse perspectives, you will make better decisions because you will be able to consider all your ideas and strategies far more comprehensively than you would if you have a room full of sort of straight white men, which policing traditionally has been. Um, you're not going to get that innovation, that cultural change and stuff, unless you introduce that diverse background and introduce it at a rank and a position where they can actually make change.
Just going on a diversity point, because I have arguments with various people on that diversity as well. How would you introduce that? Because I would say if it's through quotas, I would say that's not, I'm not a fan of quotas at all. I wouldn't say
Yeah,
that's an idea. So how would you encourage people, more people from say ethnic minorities or more women, etc., etc., to join the police force without making it into almost a tick box exercise?
yeah, and it's that's a brilliant question, and unfortunately, policing has suffered from that because it has traditionally been straight white men that run it, and they can't think of how to appeal to people outside of that demographic. To get those people in, policing needs to be a genuinely attractive offer to those people, and I think changing, like improving the wages, would be a significant step. It's also going to take that generational change, as I kind of mentioned before, about people, even sort of um, the millennial generation, have grown up with that sort of shadow of police racism and things hanging over them, or police oppression of LGBTQ communities. Um, so it's going to take that generational shift of cops going into schools, engaging with young people through that kind of community policing, and that what a sort of famous sociologist working in the 1950s, who's a sort of really influential thinker, said. Gordon Allport, and he sort of pioneered this idea of contact theory. That if you meet somebody, you become familiar with them, and therefore you become accepting and welcoming and celebratory of their views, cultures, and practices. Um, and that's really important because you need more of that in policing. And if you get more of that in policing, it becomes this ripple effect that if cops from different cultures, different religions, different ethnicities, etc., go out into the community and young people see them and can relate to them and things and say, well, if they can do that, I can do that and stuff. And at the moment, we're still at that point where it takes the disruptors to come in and go, no, what is going on at the moment or what has gone on in the past is wrong. And I want to change that for the better. We are gradually getting to that point where that tipping point is kind of just nudging over, I think, but we're not there yet. But yeah, fundamentally, we need to appeal to those communities that we want to recruit into the police, because unless we can make it a job that they want to go into, and a job that appeals as something where they will be welcomed and celebrated and have the same opportunities and things as everybody else, then it's not going to work.
Would community policing help with that? So say if you're, because a lot of people talk about there's not a lot of bobbies on the beat, as we used to call it back in the day. So if we brought those back, especially from particular areas, would that help in regards to not just having a presence of someone different on like on the beat, but also someone else to look up to as well?
Absolutely, there's absolutely no question about that. Some of my favourite times in policing were as a community police officer, and I some examples of that were that I worked the Sikh Vaisakhi parade, which is an annual event in Nottingham. It's the Sikh New Year. We were then invited to join them in the Sikh Gurdwara temple after the parade. So we did. We went and joined in, partook of the food they provided, and things, and just ended up chatting to the community. And they were sort of so pleased that we'd spent that time talking to them, learning about their culture and their religion, etc. Um, and several of them were saying like, we'd often thought about joining the police, but we didn't think we'd be welcomed and stuff. But now we might think about applying. and the same was true of the Caribbean Carnival that takes place in Nottingham every year. I worked that. I would get involved with like dancing and sort of talking to all the various community members and everything. And again, just working to break down those barriers and say, yeah, with the police, yeah, I might be a white guy walking around it, but actually, I'm really enjoying it. Like we're nothing to be scared of. We're here to help keep you safe and enjoy this kind of community event and stuff. And we're human. Like, come and talk to us. We're not these sort of scary monsters that perhaps your parents experienced 30, 40 years ago, whatever. We're here to help you. We're here to protect your community. We're here to take away, like, arrest the people that are looking to do you harm and stuff. And there's so much research out there that shows that this sort of familiarity and having this friendly face of a police officer, be that in schools or youth clubs, just or even walking around the beat and just sort of saying hello to people as they go around, can make such a huge positive difference for the police. That it's an essential part of that recruitment strategy.
If people want to find out about your work, where can they visit?
So they can catch me on LinkedIn is probably the best place to catch me. I on LinkedIn am just trying to find my profile address. I am LinkedIn/Tom-Andrews-Policing. That's where I'm most common. You can also find me through the University of Derby website. If you Google University of Derby Tom Andrews, I appear on there with links to my LinkedIn profile and my latest publications, etc.
Okay, I will leave those links in the description below this video, because obviously be on YouTube and Spotify. But Tom Andrews, has been an absolute pleasure. Certainly some thought-provoking conversation for sure. Thank you again for being a guest on the 286 project.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chris, for asking me on. Thank you.